To understand what Rome did to its own men, you first have to understand what Rome's army actually was. Not an army in the way we use that word today, not a collection of individuals organized under a flag, motivated by patriotism or ideology or the particular energy of a cause. The Roman legion was something older and colder than any of those things. It was an engineered system, a machine built from human material, assembled with the same deliberate precision that Roman engineers brought to their aqueducts and their roads and their siege engines, designed not merely to win battles, but to function with mechanical reliability regardless of the conditions imposed on it. A legionary did not simply join the army. He was absorbed into it. Across years of training so relentless and so physically and psychologically total that by the time it was complete, the man who had entered was no longer fully the man who emerged. He had been remade, his identity restructured around the unit, the standard, the eagle of the legion, the chain of command that extended upward through his centurion and his legate and his commander to Rome itself, to the abstract, immovable authority of an empire that considered his life a resource to be managed. This machine conquered the known world. It conquered Gaul and Britain and Egypt and Mesopotamia and everything in between, not primarily through superior technology or numerical advantage, but through the one quality that the Roman military system had refined beyond anything its enemies could match: absolute, unbreakable discipline. The certainty that a Roman unit would hold its formation when other armies broke, that it would advance when retreat seemed rational, that it would function with cold mechanical consistency in conditions designed to destroy cohesion and scatter men into panicking individuals. The Roman soldier, it was said, feared his own commander more than he feared the enemy. This was not a failure of the system. It was the system working precisely as designed. And to maintain that fear, to keep it sharp and functional and present in the mind of every man who stood in the line, Rome reserved for itself a weapon of such psychological sophistication that its memory has endured for 2,000 years. A punishment so carefully constructed that its genius lay not in what it did to the men it killed, but in what it did to the men it allowed to live. The forbidden archives are open. In the Roman military understanding of human nature, cowardice was not a personal failing. It was a contagion. When a unit broke and ran, when soldiers who had been trained to hold their ground turned and fled the field, or when a cohort mutinied against its officers, or when men surrendered ground that Rome had ordered them to hold at any cost, the Roman commanders did not search for the individuals who had broken first. They did not conduct interviews or examine evidence or attempt to isolate the specific men whose fear had been the first to translate into movement. The Roman military doctrine had already answered the question of guilt before it was asked, and the answer was collective. You all broke. You all ran. You are all responsible. This was not simply pragmatism, though it contained pragmatism. It was a theological statement about the nature of military obligation, a declaration that the unit was a single entity, that the bond between soldiers was not a social nicety but a contractual reality with legal and moral weight, and that the failure of any part of that entity implicated the whole. The men who had held their ground while their comrades fled were not innocent bystanders to someone else's cowardice. They were members of a body that had failed, and membership had consequences. The Roman commanders understood something about fear that more sentimental military traditions preferred not to examine directly, that the men most likely to break were not the worst soldiers but often the most rational ones. That in a moment of genuine crisis, when the enemy line was overwhelming and the formation was fragmenting and the body's every instinct was screaming for survival, the calculation that flight offered better odds than holding was not irrational. It was accurate. To override that calculation, to make standing fast feel more survivable than running, you needed to make running more terrifying than anything the enemy could offer. Not for the guilty. For everyone. And so Rome devised a punishment that did not distinguish between the man who had broken first and the man who had stood until the last possible moment before the collapse of his unit swept him away. A punishment that fell, with the beautiful and horrifying impartiality of mathematics, on everyone equally. Or almost equally. Justice, in this particular Roman expression, was not blind in the way that justice is supposed to be blind. Impartial, consistent, applied according to evidence and merit. It was blind in a different and more terrifying sense. It was random. The condemned unit was assembled. Every man, the guilty and the less guilty, and the men who had argued against the break, and the men who had been swept along by it, and the men whose precise role in the collapse could never be determined and never would be, because the determination had already been made at a level above individual culpability. They stood together, the unit that had failed, and they waited for Rome to tell them what failure cost. The process that followed was not improvised. It was a formal procedure, conducted according to established method, with the particular Roman insistence on procedural correctness that characterized everything from legal trials to engineering projects. Form mattered. The ritual of it mattered. Not despite the horror of the outcome, but because of it, because the formal, methodical quality of the proceedings was itself a communication, a demonstration that what was about to happen was not violence but administration. The unit was divided into its component groups of 10. The contubernium, the tent group, 8 to 10 men who shared a leather tent on the march, who cooked together, who slept within arm's reach of each other, who had spent years in the specific intimacy that military life produces between men who share its conditions. They knew each other with the comprehensive, involuntary thoroughness of people who have had no privacy from each other for years. They had marched together. They had fought back to back. They had sat together through the long watches of the night in foreign darkness and talked about the things that men talk about when they are far from home and the darkness is very large. They were, in the only sense that mattered in the field, family. Now they stood in their groups of 10 and they waited. The lots were prepared. Stones, in the most commonly recorded accounts, 1 black, 9 white, distributed into a helmet or a bag or whatever vessel the commanding officer had designated for this purpose. The mathematics were simple. 1 in 10. The fraction that gave the punishment its name, decimation, from the Latin for tenth. 1 man in 10 would draw the black stone. 9 men in 10 would draw white. And in that drawing, at the moment each man's hand closed around whatever stone fate had assigned him, the entire psychological architecture of what Rome was doing became visible in its full, terrible clarity. Because in the seconds before a man opened his hand, in the suspended moment between reaching into the vessel and knowing, every man in that group was simultaneously the condemned and the survivor. Every man existed, briefly, in a state of complete uncertainty about which version of the next 10 seconds he was about to inhabit. The relief of the white stone and the devastation of the black were equally possible for every hand in that circle, and the knowledge of that equal possibility was itself a form of punishment applied to everyone before the lots were even drawn. The man who drew the black stone had his fate resolved. The 9 who drew white had theirs resolved too, and then immediately discovered that resolution was not the same as relief. Because the lottery had only answered the first question. It had not answered the second. The 9 men who had drawn white stones did not walk away. They were the executioners. This was not an accident of the Roman system, not a logistical convenience, not the result of insufficient personnel for the task. It was the deliberate, calculated center of the entire mechanism, the element that separated decimation from mere collective punishment and elevated it into something that operated on a level of psychological precision that the Roman military establishment had thought through with extraordinary care. Strangers could not do this work. Not because strangers would refuse, though some might, but because strangers performing the execution would leave the 9 survivors as witnesses to a terrible event that had happened to their unit. Something external, something that the mind could eventually file under the category of things that happened, that time and distance could eventually process into something survivable without permanent structural damage. The 9 men had to do it themselves. To the man they had shared a tent with. To the man whose family they knew by name. To the man who had been at their side in every engagement and whose habits and fears and particular way of carrying himself through the world they knew the way you only know someone you have never been able to escape. The Roman military machine had calculated, correctly, that forcing men to perform this act created a wound that would not close. A division within the self, between the man who had survived by the accident of the lottery and the act that survival had required, that would make future cowardice unthinkable not through rational calculation but through something deeper and less articulable. The knowledge, carried in the body rather than the mind, of what the alternative to standing firm had cost the last time. The machine did not merely punish cowardice. It made cowardice psychologically unaffordable in a way that no external threat could replicate, because the damage it imposed was not external. It was internal. It was the modification of the men who survived into people who carried, from that point forward, an experience so psychologically definitive that it restructured everything around it. Rome did not want soldiers who were unafraid to die. It wanted soldiers who were more afraid of what they would have to do to their brothers if they ran than they were afraid of dying in the line. The documented deployments of Decimation, Crassus using it against the survivors of the Spartacus campaign, the accounts of its use in the later Republic and Empire, the records that survive in Polybius and Livy and Appian, describe not a punishment administered in rage but a procedure conducted with the affectless efficiency of men who understood they were performing a function of the military system rather than expressing an emotion. The commanders who ordered it were not monsters in the theatrical sense. They were administrators, applying a tool that the institution had provided, in the service of objectives that the institution had defined. That cold administrative quality was itself the horror. It communicated, with complete clarity, that the Roman military machine did not hate the men it destroyed. It did not fear them or pity them or feel anything about them in particular. It processed them with the same systematic dispassion that it processed any resource that required management. The 9 men who had drawn white stones learned what they were to Rome in the moment they were required to demonstrate it. They were instruments, and instruments do not get to grieve what they have been used for. When it was over, the survivors were not welcomed back. The Roman ritual of decimation did not conclude with a speech about redemption, about the unit having paid its debt and being restored to standing. The punishment did not end with the lottery. What followed the lottery was a second degradation, quieter than the first but in its own way more psychologically precise. A sustained condition of shame applied not over hours but over weeks, designed to communicate through daily lived experience what the cowardice of the unit had cost and what its survivors had become. They were expelled from the camp. Not temporarily. Not symbolically. The surviving men of a decimated unit were required to bivouac outside the fortified perimeter, outside the walls that represented Roman military civilization, outside the protection of the structure they had failed to defend with sufficient honor. They slept in the open, exposed to whatever conditions the campaign imposed, without the security of the camp that their comrades inside continued to inhabit. Their rations were changed. Wheat, the staple of the Roman soldiers' diet, the grain that the legions depended on, that Rome had organized entire logistical systems to deliver, was replaced with barley. Barley was animal feed. The deliberate substitution communicated, in the language of daily sustenance, the unit's current status in the Roman military hierarchy. They ate what animals ate because the Roman institution had determined that they had, by their failure, forfeited the full status of Roman soldiers. They lived in this condition for a period determined by their commander, long enough for the message to be completely absorbed, for every meal of barley and every night outside the walls to perform its function as a reminder and a lesson. And then they were permitted back. But the men who returned were not the men who had left. The Roman military system had no vocabulary for what they carried, no category for the particular compound of guilt and survival and complicity that the lottery and its aftermath had created in the men who had drawn white stones and done what the white stones required. The institution that had broken them had no interest in their psychological reconstruction. It had achieved what it required, a unit that would not break again, that could not break again, not because its courage had been restored but because its relationship to cowardice had been permanently and irrevocably altered. The machine had processed them. What emerged from the processing was functional. It would hold the line. It would not run. Whether it was still, in any meaningful human sense, what had entered, whether the men who eventually completed their service and returned to civilian life carried anything back with them that resembled the people they had been before the lottery, was not a question that Rome asked. The machine had no mechanism for asking it. The machine only measured outcomes that the machine cared about. In this, decimation was the perfect expression of what Roman military power actually was beneath the eagles and the standards and the centuries of celebrated victories. A system that measured human beings entirely by their utility, that processed them toward institutional objectives with complete indifference to what that processing cost them, and that called the result of that processing discipline. No legion that had witnessed decimation mutinied again. The calculation had worked. And 2,000 years later, the word itself, decimation, has outlasted the empire that invented it, outlasted the legions that administered it, outlasted every specific historical instance of its application, and persisted in the language as a term for catastrophic loss. We use it without thinking about where it came from. Without thinking about the tent groups and the black stone and the 9 men standing outside the walls eating barley in the dark. Without thinking about what Rome decided, with complete institutional seriousness, that discipline required. History does not bury its horrors because they are unimportant. It buries them because they are mirrors, and the reflection never quite goes away. This has been the Forbidden Archives. The files are never truly closed.